So I've decided that I'm going to start making knives from ground flat stock rather than simply re-engineering other knives. And one of the steps that I realized I needed to make in order to be able to do this was to be able to heat treat the knives once I'd actually created the blades. So I decided to make myself a forge rather than simply use a blowtorch to heat the blades, as this would allow a little bit more efficiency, a little bit more consistency, and just generally a slightly easier workflow. I went online, as a lot of people do, and looked at coffee can forges, and initially decided I was going to go with something along those lines, but slightly more over-engineered. So I got a simple paint tin, a 5-litre paint tin, and started designing a forge around that. So I decided I was going to use a door handle. It's an old door handle that I used for the top. I had to cut down the screws slightly to make sure they were going to be short enough so that they would fit in place well. And then I had some spare coach bolts left over from a previous project that I decided to use as the legs. So I drilled holes in what would become the top and the bottom, and I used large penny washers to be able to hold everything in place. The benefit of coach bolts for the legs was that I could adjust the height at a later point if it was on uneven ground. So I created the basic outline using these components and had a self-standing cylindrical object. There seemed to be some discrepancy in terms of how the inside should be lined. One thing I did know is I wanted to make sure I had a proper lining, so I ordered some kale wool off eBay, got it from a culinary supply store, and cut it to fit. I wanted to have 2 layers lining my forge because this would create a good, strong, solid insulation for the forge. I cut that shape and lined my forge with it, and then used a drill bit just to be able to go through that kale wool to be able to then assemble my legs and my handle, using the washers to be able to hold that kale wool against the edges of the forge. In a perfect world, I would have used a rigidizer to be able to make sure that the kale wool stayed firm, but unfortunately I couldn't find any of that easily available. Kale wool is not the nicest thing to work with in the world, which is why I'm wearing gloves and a mask. It just, it reminded me of the good old-fashioned glass fibre insulation. I'm sure it will not do you quite as much harm as that, but certainly you definitely don't want to be heating it up in its bare state. So I also cut a side inlet for the MAP gas burner to be able to fire the forge. I made sure to cut the kale wool from around the entrance point for the burner to make sure that that could be lined so there was no exposed kale wool there either. The weather had turned a little bit interesting at this point. It's been generally quite nice so far, but definitely wasn't quite so good for this point. The delights of early English summer. Once I got it all constructed, a lot of the guidelines on YouTube said to simply use a plaster of Paris and sand mix. Now this is where, when I've called this making an improved coffee can forge, I have to hold my hands up and say I had not done enough research at this point into the best way to make a forge. I had found out about the kaol wool, and that was a very useful point, but I decided at this point to fill it with plaster of Paris and sand, which generally seems to be, at a quick search, what people seem to recommend. So I completely over-engineered a way to be able to make the form, to be able to create the center. I used an old cider bottle and a wooden spoon, both wrapped in cling film with a little bit of Vaseline on there to make sure it didn't stick, and had to find a way to suspend the bottle so that it wouldn't hit the bottom. I'm sure there is a simpler way to do this. I then mixed up the plaster of Paris and sand mix and proceeded to pour it in, only to then realise that, of course, an empty bottle will just want to float on top of the plaster of Paris. So I then had to fill the bottle with water and continue to pour. I also hadn't quite done my volumetric measurements well enough, and so I had mixed up 3 kilos of mixture, so a kilo of plaster of Paris, kilo of sand and kilo of water. And it didn't quite fill the mould as far as I wanted it to. So I made sure that I completely sealed the kaol wool with the plaster of Paris by spreading it over the top and over the edges. And then waited for everything to set while my pregnant wife looked on, slightly confused. She also does a very good job of making sure she always cleans up after me, for which I am eternally grateful. So once it had all set and I'd pulled the bottle and the wooden spoon out, I made sure that the tunnel for the blowtorch was completely clear using a round file, and then gave it a quick test fire. So you can see it here. It turns out that filming in bright daylight doesn't give the best indication of the flame inside, so I waited until the shadow had come across. I also wanted to have a magnet on the outside of the forge so that I could check for that critical temperature in normalizing and quenching. So I found a magnet on eBay, which came with a handy little screw, and attached it to the outside of my forge. Here you can see it heating for the first time, and me filling my quench tank with rapeseed oil, which is what they know as canola oil in the US. One little tip: oil will always expand when you heat it, so don't fill it all the way to the top when it's cold, because it will just overflow. This was my first test piece. It was a little knife maker's brooch, which I will do a video on as well. I made a major error here. Thankfully it worked, but I waited way too long after taking it out of the forge before I then put it into the quench. But the good news is, on a very basic level, the forge worked. So this is why you shouldn't just believe anything that you read on the internet or see on YouTube. Not that I'm dissing YouTube, but one of the issues with this is actually there's a lot of cracking, and I've done some research and subsequent reading, and it seems that plaster of Paris is what a lot of people say you should use, and then you look into it and realise you really shouldn't. Yeah, there's a lot of damage going on just from a few test fires yesterday. So I got some proper fire cement, refractory cement. Emma has willingly suggested I might be able to sacrifice this. I'm just going to try and reline some of it, just so I can get a better, more solid forge. I also discovered that I definitely didn't make it long enough. So one of the things that I discovered was my knives will not balance. They won't hold themselves in there as it is at the moment, because as soon as I let them go, they just want to fall out, which apparently isn't a good thing when you're dealing with red hot metal. And so I managed to normalize one of my blades yesterday, but it meant I had to hold on to it for the entire time, which made it all rather hot. So I have two plans with this. One is to sort of reline the inside slightly and just reinforce where that damage is, and then secondly I'm going to add just a little bit to this front section to create a bit of a table, as it were. It's not like a true forging table, but just it means it'll be long enough that I'll be able to actually leave it without holding onto it the whole time. Right, so that's got the inside basically relined. This is not a perfect job. This is about making sure that things are a little bit more reinforced, because I suspect that at some point I will redo this completely. So the basic concept for the issue for plaster of Paris and sand is what, if you go on YouTube and look up how to make a coffee can filter, that's what they all suggest. And the reason they all suggest it is because it's very, very easy. It's very quick and it's very simple. And as we all know, if something's quick and easy and simple, that's definitely the right way to do it, right? There are two issues. One is it's not actually very strong. It tends to fall apart pretty quickly. It may well fall apart and just break on you, which is obviously not a good thing, particularly when you're dealing with red hot materials. Secondly, from a science point of view, it is a massive heat sink. So essentially, you're trying to heat the forge, and what you want to do is heat what's in the forge rather than heating the forge. Obviously, the forge will get hot while you're working on it because you're pumping a huge amount of power into it, but you want more of the heat to go into actually heating what's in the forge than the forge itself. And essentially that's what happens with plaster of Paris. It just heats the plaster of Paris, which is not what we're after. So this is proper refractory cement, fire cement. You can get even stronger versions of this. Is designed for fires, wood burning stoves and low level forges. It's designed to be able to withstand quite happily up to, I think this one's 1200 degrees centigrade. You can get cements that are designed to go significantly hotter than that, but I don't think this is going to ever go hotter than that. I doubt it anyway. The other benefit bringing this further forward is my burner is slightly forward facing. So what I discovered was, in order to get the whole surface hot, the whole piece hot, I ended up having to bring it slightly forward, which means that you fall out even more easily. So by doing this, it should allow me to heat the blade more evenly. I did do some things right. I used Kea wool to line it, and plaster of Paris will, to some extent, sealed that, and that's one of the most important things. You really need to make sure that is well sealed, because heating Kea wool is not nice. So some refractory cements will set on contact with oxygen. This one required heat to set it, but putting the blowtorch on it when it was still unset was too hot. So actually what I decided to do was put it into the oven and allow it to set in the oven over the course of about 3 or 4 hours at its top temperature. It has cracked a little, but I'm not too concerned about that. But it has created a much stronger, much more efficient and much safer forge. So you can see here it getting its first heat after setting, and it's created a much better vortex inside. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope that all of this has been helpful. I hope that it will help you design a better forge than the standard coffee can forge that you find on YouTube. Please subscribe for more knife making videos. Please like the video if you liked it and found it helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, please put them below and I will do my best to get back to you. So thank you very much. Bye bye.